So we've got maybe let's wait for, first and foremost, hi everyone. Thanks so much for making time to join us for this session this afternoon. So we've got a few more people who are coming in. So let's give them a minute or two just to trickle in before we start. So for my time, it's 4:33. So let's start at 4:35 latest. Okay. Actually, I think the number looks good right now, so I believe we can start. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for making time to attend Project Vocal's second capacity building program. As some of you may have already know, Project Vocal is fueled by the Global Environment Facility Small Grants Program of the United Nations Development Program. So before I introduce the speakers, I'd like to let you know that there will be a Q&A session at the end of the discussion. After the Q&A session, we will have a breakout session in which there will be prizes to be won, and everyone will be receiving an e-certificate as well as a small gift from us for participating today. As a side note, participants can channel their questions during the Q&A session via the chat box. Last but not least, this session will be recorded, so if participants do not want to be featured, please turn off their cameras. Moving on into the speakers, today we have Mr. Muru Loganathan with us, as well as Emily Oy and Jasmine Arisha Jim Ilham. Mr. Muru is an energy and climate change advisor to the British High Commission Kuala Lumpur. He is a wetland ecologist with 10 years of field experience in Wetlands International prior to joining the British High Commission in 2005. His areas of experience include rapid ecological assessments of wetland habitats, co-writing in sustainable management prescription, as well as addressing cases for conservation and protection of key ecosystems. Mr. Muru has contributed to 3 Ramsar sites nominations for Malaysia and their integrated management plans. And having been with BHC for the last 15 years, his commitment to lobbying for key shared global environment goals aims to strengthen the UK-Malaysia relationship in the environmental, climate, and energy spaces. Moving on is Emily Oy. She is a senior analyst at the Malaysian Green Technology and Climate Change Center. Currently, she is specializing in national green technology and climate mitigation related policy analysis, covering policy interventions in emissions-intensive sectors such as energy, transport, waste, manufacturing, building, as well as water. She has experience in corporate sustainability advisory, sustainability strategy formulation, as well as reporting frameworks for Malaysian public listed companies. They span across power, utilities, plantations, as well as properties. Prior to MGTC, she was attached to Ernst & Young's Malaysia's Climate Change and Sustainability Services Advisory Team, as well as YTL Corporation Berhad's Group Sustainability Division. She was actually part of the Malaysian Youth Delegation in various capacities, ranging from mentoring, managing, as well as training the delegation on UNFCCC climate negotiations. And she attended COP21 as a youth civil society organization representative. Last but not least, we've got Jasmine, who is a climate and environment consultant at Unicef Malaysia, whereby she champions in mobilizing young people on climate action. She was also the former manager of the Malaysian Youth Delegation, whereby she tracked the UNFCCC COP climate change negotiations during her years with MYD. Jasmine obtained her master's in climate and society from Columbia University, majoring in climate science with concentration in climate policy, international environmental law, as well as global governance. Previously, she researched on sustainable development at the Science Policy Practice Nexus, where she focused on the intersection of food systems, gender, local knowledge, as well as climate adaptation at leading think tanks, such as Jeffrey Sachs Center on Sustainable Development, University Science Malaysia, as well as the International Research Institute on Climate and Society, the Earth Institute, and NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies in New York. Fun fact, so Jasmine and Emily are actually my seniors from university, and they were the reason that I joined the Malaysian Youth Delegation in 2017. All right, so as you can see, we've got a rich array of speakers today, and I hope all of you will bask in all of their knowledge and experience that they're about to share today. Without further ado, I'll kick off this session with the first question, which will be open to all of the panelists. So yeah, here we go. So as someone who has engaged with and been to several international conferences, roundtable meetings, as well as discussions, what would you tell those who are interested to be part of the decision-making process in terms of what to expect during these sessions? Essentially, why is it important for youth to be part of the decision-making process? Perhaps we could start off with Jasmine.
Wow, thank you so much, Shakil. I was hoping that we go through like your introduction round, so maybe Mr. Buru could have gone first, but I guess I can start first. Hi everyone, my name is Jasmine. Thank you so much for having me today. I am excited to share with you a bit of my knowledge, and as the title of this session goes, it's behind the scenes, the truth behind youth and decision-making processes. So I hope I can share a thing or two which would benefit you, but mostly to share about more on my experience, something that you don't normally get to read up. It's something that we have to actually go through to learn about the whole process. Shakil's question is, as someone who has engaged and have been to international conferences and meetings, like what to expect, like how, like why is it important for youth to take part? I guess essentially, firstly, I would say to know your stuff, like know what you're attending, do your homework, and know what you're getting into in the first place. It's really good to be over prepared. You don't want to enter a meeting not knowing why you're there or not knowing who you're going to talk to, because you're just setting yourself up for failure, and we don't want that. And of course, read up before entering a certain meeting. Just to give you a couple of examples, with the Malaysian Youth Delegation, even though we attend the big climate conference at the end of the year, normally the UNFCCC COP will happen either November or December at the end of the year. We've actually started with our training processes and our homework and our knowledge seeking process like 12 months in advance, or 9 to 12 months in advance, getting to familiarize with the whole negotiation process, getting to familiarize with each negotiating tracks when it comes to mitigation, adaptation, and then going more towards into specific topics like global stocktake or climate finance. But that is just like a very big overarching example. I can give you like sort of more relatable example lah. So for example, macam this particular session, right? Before you attend this, you kind of like read up like who are the speakers, what are the speakers' background. Probably some of you already came prepared with questions in mind, which is great. That is sort of like the rule of thumb before attending anything, whether like it's a small scale meeting or large scale conferences. It's really important to be prepared and to know what you're getting into. So I think that sort of set the stage for what Emily and Mr. Muru can chime in.
Yep, Emily, please, by all means.
Thank you, Shakil. Thank you, Jasmine, for opening it nicely with the international negotiation setup. I think also, I think me coming from MGTC, I would like to also highlight on the national level. So I've personally been attending a few national policy workshops and roundtables. So I would say the process is pretty much the same as the UN level, like what Jasmine have highlighted. And preparation-wise, it is also pretty much the same. You have to first do your homework because you're normally this is on invitation basis. So they don't really open to all unless it's a public participation, open day or something like that. So if you want to be impactful and you need to be strategic in attending all these events or workshops. So make sure that you know what to present or share during the session. So what you can do if you're representing an organization or even you yourself, you should be able to comprehend some local solutions or local problems that that you wish to raise up, and find the best time to present it or raise up during the session. That is one of the best way for you to take note by the organizer or the policymakers. And I think secondly, being a youth, sometimes you feel intimidating attending all these events because not everybody is, familiar with policy making process, and sometimes the language that they use might be very scary as well. You just go in and you don't understand what they're saying. So I think part of the process is, of course, to be confused and be afraid, because you're not born to know all these things. So don't be afraid to attend different type of policy making related sessions, even if you don't understand. But over the time, you will start to grasp the idea of this is the typical process. These are the few language and framework that they normally use. And I think that is part of the capacity building for youth to be part of the policy making process. And in the future, when you grown up, become a professional, like all of us, and the moderator and the speakers here, you can give more substantial inputs during all the sessions. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Emily. I remember going for my first COP, and honestly, it was nerve wracking. Like as one of our members used to say, it was definitely a circus. On to you, Mr. Muru. We'd love to hear your take on the question as well.
What can I say? I was a youth 20 years ago, no more. But we all go through their phases, isn't it? Being that age, when I was growing up, a lot of these things were, one way, right? You listen to your elders, you listen to your teachers, your lecturers. The culture was so much different. Social media was not there. The space to interact on issues a bit more lesser. What we all do is basically we just play games, right? We are not bothered about what's happening in the country. Obviously, 20 years ago, probably environmental degradation, and nobody was talking about climate change in Malaysia. So I grew in an era like that, and coming now to this century, and the space for youth is so great, right? I mean, whether it's international, whether it's national, Youth Watch is such an important thing. So it's important for you all to be upfront on these issues, because if you look at the Malaysian population of 32 million people, I'm taking a very conventional, anyone below 40 and above 15 years old, I think we are looking at easily about 60% of our population fall into that category. So a very strong voice. So, I think a lot of people don't understand the power of youth, and you put that as a registered voter, right? If Undi 18, for example, or anyone above 18 and above become registered voters, right up to 39 years old, we are also looking, I was just looking at the latest stats on that. If all of them register, for example, and obviously not everyone is a registered voter, we are looking at about 60% of our youth population between the age of 18 and 30 or 40 or 39. That's a lot, right? You can determine which government comes into play, and you can determine what are the issues that you want to raise with your leaders, with the government in play. So never underestimate the powers that you have, and that powers includes in areas like climate change, sustainability, and environmental integrity and stuff like that. So I just want to end up with that little piece of note that you have the powers. Now the question is, how do we exercise the power in a very responsible, impactful, and bring change where Malaysia is on a lot of the sustainability issues at this point of time. Thank you, Shakil.
Thank you so much, Mr. Muru. So on that note, I'd like to have a follow-up question. So you mentioned the whole notion of Undi 18. You mentioned about the youth having to be upfront and having to make our voices heard. But the fact of the matter is, not a lot of us know the forefront issues when it comes to the environment and climate change in Malaysia. So if you could share with us some of the issues that youth should be following, should be paying attention to here locally, what would they be?
Well, for me is important the fact that impacts of climate change. People always talk about, we don't see it anything, but actually it's happening. Climate change is already happening. It's essential. Sometimes you don't notice it. The frequency of freak weathers, the frequency of intense rain, storm has increased. Temperatures, we can't predict the seasons anymore. if you're living in the coastal areas, you see bits and pieces of really bad storm surges and stuff like that. So it's already happening. So it can impact livelihoods, it can impact agriculture productivity, it can impact health. As temperature rises, then the cases of dengue actually moving along to higher altitude. So all that has impacts. The only thing is whether we want to notice it and whether our scientists are coming together. There's a lot of research out there. People are putting out evidences out there. I mean, the thing is, the science is quite strong. Science will always improve. We are seeing it. So the question is, how do you bring all this, right? The only thing for us is, I mean, if somebody asks me, do you believe in climate change? Yes, I believe. But then they'll say, right, I mean, I think I believe. That's a great way to start. The question is, do you really are convinced? Do you see the impacts? Have you seen the concerns? Have you articulated the concerns? The question is, then are you finding solutions to the problem? So there's so many ways the youth can look at. You must see where you are, that whole sphere of, I'm just thinking about it. It's my thinking, but I haven't gone beyond that. Then believing it, then having a conviction that, wow, we really need to do something about it, articulating your concerns, and looking at evidence. The only way you can look at evidence is through impacts, right? You're seeing impacts, and how do you relate that to climate? And obviously, some of them are probably really what you call the other level of finding solutions. People like Jasmine, people like Emily, people like Shaki, already the process of looking at solutions. How can we find solutions to the problem? How can we bring all society approach to that? How can we improve policy making and stuff like that? So I think the thinking needs to be there. I'm happy to say that Malaysian youth are there. I mean, organizations like Econites and a lot of NGOs that are working in the space. There's a lot of young people working in that space. The question is, how do you bring all this information uh, to a place where wider mobilization of youth can understand the issues and start doing stuff at your local level, right? I mean, people talk climate change as a global agenda, it is, but your actions need to be very local. So, whether you are starting it from home, whether you're starting it from your neighborhood, at your municipality or councils, right up to state level, to national levels, and or even global level. So you need to see, as I think Emily and Justin mentioned, you always must know where you want to start. Don't think too big. Just start very small, very nearby, talking to friends, even family members. If you are already, a professional, probably your influences will be much better. But you're still living with your parents, maybe you can start doing stuff with your parents, with your neighbors, friends, close circles. So I guess always take the small steps rather than doing something, looking very far ahead. Yeah. So that would be my small tips at this point of time.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mr. Muru. Yeah. So the fact of the matter is the climate crisis is a global issue, but it doesn't take away the fact that as individuals, we have our parts to play. So as a follow-up to the question, Emily, since you work with the Malaysian Green Tech and Climate Change Center, and as a youth who has started off with the Malaysian Youth Delegation to being where you are now, what would you share to youth such as ourselves when it comes to paying attention to specific policy-related issues in Malaysia? I'm thinking something along the likes of perhaps the National Adaptation Plan, the Climate Change Act. Wondering what you have to say about that.
Yeah, thank you, Shakil. Actually, the thing about all these environmental issues, to me, is not about what you should be focusing on or concerned about, because all of them are interrelated, and we cannot be just cherry picking. Oh, I just want to know about climate change, just want to know about biodiversity, because policy is also about alignment of policy and as well as misalignment of policy. So in order to look at this two spectrum of things, you need to understand the interrelationship between the different parts of environmental issues. So for example, biodiversity, how does it impact climate change, and marine pollution, plastic pollution, how is it related to climate change? So you can't really, just focus on one and not talk about the other. That's my message, first message. And secondly, about National Adaptation Plan and also Climate Change Act. Unfortunately, I'm not here on behalf of the ministry. I'm only an agency rep. So I can't really tell any official insights, but what I would say, it is definitely moving towards the right direction, slowly but surely. And I think it is a good sign that our government is gradually looking at all this green and climate change agenda very closely. So I think we at the same time on the implementation level, we should be equipping ourselves so that when the government is want to engage with us, we're ready to provide what we can tell. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Emily. And for Jasmine, bearing in mind what Mr. Muru has shared, bearing in mind what Emily has shared, I think the question still begs as to why young people should be paying attention to these issues in the first place when we have experts to be dealing with them. So, what are your thoughts on that? Why should we, as young and future generations, be so concerned about these things when we have experts who are in the house? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Shakil. When Mr. Muru was sharing earlier on, you know, he shared a bit on facts about how youth voices are so important, and I do agree with that. I just want to share about a recent study that we did that was published around like end of last year, November 2020. It's a study that was conducted by UNDP, Unicef, and also Project Vocal of Economics. It's called Change for Climate, and it basically showcases the findings of National Youth Climate Change Survey. I'll just drop it in the chat if anyone wants to take a look at it. Basically, the finding found that about 92% of young people think that climate change is a crisis. That's the majority of it, right? Based on our sample. And also, I also want to support Mr. Moore's point that, climate change is actually closer to us than we think. About 9 out of 10 Malaysian youth have experienced climate or environmental related impacts in the past 3 years. And this includes like flooding, haze, and it's, I think by now has become a yearly occurrence that we live through every year. So, I mean, just basing off that fact, young people do have a very important voice and a very huge voice to play, especially in addressing climate change impacts. But also, just referring back again to the report, you have really skewed answers to like how young people sort of take action against climate change. Like majority of them said that yeah, they are already taking individual actions against climate change, but also some portion of them expressed that okay, they are really worried about climate change. They're really anxious. Like they know it's a problem, but at the same time they don't know where to start or how to start. This is the area that we need to address, and this is where we need to help each other in terms of providing platform, providing accessibility, providing resources. And we live in a day and age where it's so easily accessible, like all of the information is at our fingertips. All we have to do is Google. But also more than that, to sort of gather support and also find your network, find your tribe. If you're interested in climate change policy, like look up the organizations in Malaysia that focuses on climate change policies, such as the Malaysian Youth Delegation. I'm a bit biased, sorry. But there are other organizations as well, such as Kami, Equinites, Project Youth, and digital advocacy now is a really big thing. They are so vocal on social media, such as Instagram and Twitter. And if you could look them up, maybe you would feel less alone, because sometimes I do also feel that, in thinking about like all this climate change and COVID and pandemic, it can get a bit overwhelming. But just reach out to these organizations or even us, individuals that you know who are working in the climate change or environmental space. Ask for advice, ask for guidance, and you'd be surprised that they are more than willing to help you out in this journey.
Thank you so much for that, Jasmine. All right, so you mentioned about other organizations such as Kami, such as Project Youth. I understand, yeah, so on that note, there are lots of youth environmental organizations out there from whom you can reach out to and just ask them about their take on the whole issue of climate change. So moving on to the next question, and it somewhat ties to the previous question. Perhaps we could go with Emily. So in your opinion, how can we spark interest in environmental solutions amongst the youth? And in your opinion, how can we further guide them in the policymaking sphere?
Thank you, Shakil. I think being in this policy line for a few years, I have realized something that I really want to share with you guys. Reading the policy itself is very easy. Understanding it is also not so hard. The toughest part is actually implementing it and reviewing it. So I would really, really strongly urge all of you, if you think policy making, okay, so policy making is a cycle. You develop, you formalize it, then you implement, monitor, and then you review. And the largest part actually is implementing it. So if you think reading policy is not really your thing, probably you can start with involving in the implementation itself. For example, the National Green Technology Policy or the National Climate Change Policy. Find out what is the implemented part already. And if you have the chance to ever attend a session or even be part of the program that was implemented, just participate and talk to the project owners and what are the challenges and all that. Or even you yourself can be a participant itself. Not just that, and also probably some incentive that government had come up with. Be a user and go and use it, and then you can find out, oh, actually this incentive is not really good. It might look good in the beginning, but in the long run it's not. Something like that. So that is actually, I think, the easiest way for people to relate to policy making. Be part of the implementation, experience it. Then from there you can actually provide concrete feedback to policymakers when they want to review it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that, Emily. What about Mr. Muru? Would you like to chip into this question?
I think my context is, I totally agree with Emily that every policy will have its action plans and implementation. And that's where I think as youth, you're starting early, you probably want to look at where exactly I can make a difference, where I can contribute in those actions. But I would like to go back 2 steps backwards, that I think youth need to be involved in the whole process of developing the policy, a co-creation of a process, which is not happening at this stage. I know it's happening, but the question is, are they youth playing a big role? For example, is the government telling us, tell us what exactly troubles you all, what do you all like to see the future? But every survey or every engagement, I think the last engagement they did under the previous BN government was this TNA 50, I think. If you remember, one of the lab youth canvas engagement they did was also sustainability. I think about 2 million youth turned up and provided inputs, if not mistaken. And they said that they really worry for the future of the planet and where Malaysia is heading, whether it's the energy space, whether it's pollution, whether it's climate change, whether it's protecting our biodiversity. So the question is, if government engages us very early, right, before you go into any legislation or any policy making. So if you can start getting them there, these processes, and develop them through the process, I'm pretty sure every policy there are very many vested interest groups, right? But the question is, can we get the youth very early in the process? So they go through, they understand, they give their inputs. And when you come right up to the implementation, the action plan side, then everything looks quite seamlessly. So they really know what to do. So, trying to get them involved at the end is okay, but I think it'll be much more fruitful or more impactful if, some of these mobilized, really organized youth organizations that's representing the youth of Malaysian youth voices can be at the very front of when government is talking about policy already. Okay, we need to look into such policy. So the informer can start at that stage. I think it'll be much useful. I think that's the trend that's happening all over the world. I don't think so. It's just we are expecting this for Malaysia, advocating for Malaysia. But I think at some point it will come. The question is, I think that step up needs to happen fast because I think we all agreed that we need to take action of climate, and that time is now rather than 20 or 30 years down the road. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Mr. Muru. I totally agree. The fact of the matter is, as young and future generations, we will be facing the brunt of the climate crisis, and we need to take ownership of the issue. And if it is not us who takes ownership of the issue, then who does? So moving on from that question, again, Mr. Muru, as a follow-up, how do you suggest you stay engaged with current developments as well as changes in environmental or climate-related laws or policies in Malaysia? We know that as mentioned by you earlier, we knew we need to make our voices heard. But as far as staying engaged and constantly following up with these developments, what do you have to say about that?
I would say, I mean, this point of time, the question is, when you look at uh, when government is trying to do a new legislation, or government is trying to amend a legislation, or government is looking at new policies, whether it's environment, climate change or not, there's always this room for consultation. The question is, you find a lot of civil societies or vested interest groups probably more active. The question is, at this point of time, I think a lot of NGOs in the space probably will try to speak on behalf of the youth voice. But the question is, can the youth have their own voice in the whole process? The question is, where is that? Who's going to mobilize that? Bearing in mind, we don't have a Greta Thunberg. The question is, do we need a Greta Thunberg for Malaysia rather than having champions across different areas of expertise? I think that need to happen, and we need to find a platform. As Emily said, and Jasmine said, there are already youth organizations looking into it. You got people like youth parliamentarians, you got digital parliament, you got Undi 18, we got Econites, we got MOID, we got Kami, we got Klima. So many different organizations representing the youth. The question is, question is they need to be sensitized. The question is they need to be mobilized in a very structured manner so they can give inputs. Inputs for government plans happens from a residential area right up to state plans, local government plans, right up to national plans. So the question is, who's going to take the proactive roles of ensuring that youth voice is organized, structured, and we bring those voices together. We do a lot of sessions with them so that those voices will be reflected in any options or any window for government policies to be debated publicly. There is the law allows for public consultation. It's important that the youth voice is captured in that. So the question is, how do we do that? How do you reach out to the youth groups? I mean, social media is a great platform. I think that's the best thing that's ever happened. Any public engagement. The question is, who's going to do the lead role of ensuring that these informations are being sent out, something is being organized for inputs, so that the youth, whether it's through the civil societies or having their own way of organizing themselves and providing those strategic inputs, it's fair or not. I mean, the wish list can be a lot. I mean, I'm not saying that you should stop. I think you should reach for the stars in terms of what you want from the government, because as Shakil said, yeah, you are the future. I won't be around 30 years down the road, hopefully not. But a lot of these policies are long term. People talking about already net zero at this point of time, how to hit net zero by 2050, and we are still looking at how to get ourselves employed, find a decent job, improve our livelihood, and we are talking about obtaining a degree, when many countries out there talking about how the world would be in 2050 in a net zero capacity. So there's a few tips there. I mean, I'm not saying that it's easy, but I think processes are starting at this point of time. The question is, how can we get more youth, mobilize more youth into the process and ensure that it's really representing the so-called 60% of our population in Malaysia in every little feedback the government is trying to get out of us. And don't ever forget that we also have a role to play when businesses also looking for plans, businesses also looking how they could improve their business in the sustainability factor. So it's not just government, it's also looking at how we can tap into how businesses can be more sustainable. And the youth voice is also important because you're also a bigger consumer group buying all those goods and services or using their services. So that's how I see it. Thanks, Shakil.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mr. Muru. Jasmine, I'd like to hear your take on this question. You're a youth expert with Unicef. Prior to getting involved with climate change advocacy, you were very active in a lot of environmental initiatives, even with the university itself. So what's your secret about staying engaged with regards to current developments on environmental and climate related issues?
I don't think there's any secret, to be honest. I feel like I have a lot to add on to Mr. Muru's point, but like I'll just keep it short and concise. Yeah, so absolutely whatever and everything that Mr. Muri just said in terms of having a dedicated platform for young people to voice their opinions, to have an input in a consultative process to climate policies and climate planning in this country, we really, really need to have that platform being set up. And that's actually one of the things that we're doing under UNICEF, and UNICEF is sort of trying to help to facilitate, coordinate, and mobilize that process as well. So just like, okay, I guess to take a step back, a brief overview of climate change within the UNICEF structure is in Malaysia, it's still relatively new. Globally, there has been work in the intersection of children's rights and climate change for many years already, but regionally it's fairly new, and within Malaysia is about a year plus. The UN agency in Malaysia that handles a lot of climate change and environmental related portfolios is under UNDP, which is the Development Program. So just like how UNDP helps facilitate and coordinate climate planning and policies in Malaysia, UNICEF also does that, but from a child-sensitive approach and inclusivity in terms of children and youth approach within the climate process. So we are more towards that angle. And we also do work closely with ministries such as the Ministry of Environment, CASA, to sort of help facilitate this process. So it has begun, but as with everything, it takes time. And I'm really open to hearing your suggestions. By the way, those of you who are in the audience here, on like what are your thoughts in terms of having like a dedicated platform where youth can provide their opinions and input in policy making and decision making processes, because as everyone knows, climate change is an intersectoral and intersectional issue. When you talk about climate change, it's not just climate change policies, it's like human rights and climate change, biodiversity and climate change, forests, nature, water, like everything comes under the climate change umbrella. How do we incorporate that together and make sure that this like youth coalition or youth platform is inclusive of all of these issues, and not just that, but inclusive of vulnerable groups, and also representation of youth, women, indigenous, and disabled persons. So it's really, when we put together this sort of like dedicated platform, it's really important to be mindful of the approaches and also the representation of different groups, because ultimately we want to have it inclusive, but also we want to have it very focused towards the discussion in terms of moving forward with the agenda.
Right. Thank you so much for that, Jasmine. Oh, it's been a very rich discussion, and I'd love to go on, but I understand that we've got a lot of questions from the floor as well. So yeah, without further ado, we will moving into the Q&A session, and I'd like to start off with a question from the chat. So let me read it out. So I watched Greta Thunberg's documentary. She got invited to all these kind of big meetings and conferences. And she said that all these meetings / conference felt like a show, just for publicity. The people making decisions aren't really listening or taking actions. Has this ever happened to you, and how do you deal with it? Perhaps we could get this this answered from either Jasmine or Emily.
Emily, you want to go first? I can go first. Yeah. I think it's because like we have been to these international fancy conferences, and I think Crystal, what you said is absolutely true. Most of the time we feel like it's for show. I mean, it's a really great feat, like getting all these 197 countries together at the same platform, at the same conference, talking about really important issues. But at the same time, you also reflect back, like, why is there 26 COPs already, right? Like, there must be something, or, you know, like, why does it take so long to have something being solved? But, you know, everyone have their own role to play, and everyone's presence and voices are important, and they carry weight. The decision makers and the country leaders have their own tasks and responsibilities to do, as with the young person who attends these conferences as well. Emily, I think you can like go on how we do like advocacy and activism within the conference space. But I think like your voice and the value that you bring to the table really does matter. And even though you feel like it is not moving, you should not belittle your value, or you should not dismiss how important your voice is when it comes to the conversations surrounding climate change.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jasmine. Actually, so as a follow-up, Emily, because Jasmine actually mentioned activism, so there is a question on that I'd like to hear from you because it's related. So the question goes like this: has the recent growth in climate justice activism, especially those that are youth-centric, we're talking about Fridays for Future, we're talking about Extinction Rebellion, in your opinion, do these influence the policy-making process? To what extent does activism help in general Malaysia as well as internationally? Emily.
Thank you, Sylvie. Sylvie, thank you for your question. Very interesting question. Coming from a Malaysian myself, I personally think activism is not really well received in our country, unfortunately. And if you notice, all these Fridays for Future, all this movement are very Western narrated. And so it might be effective at that part of the world, but it doesn't mean it will work the same in Malaysia. And I think based on my experience dealing with the government and now with the government, I don't think activism is the most effective way to get our government to really take action, unless it's something really urgent or really, our government is very what's that word? They just react. They're very reactive. Sorry, yeah, that's the word. So, but I think we shouldn't give up from doing activism in Malaysia, because things will change over the years, and I think over the years we have also seen new activism, especially in climate, and also led by youth like Kami, going on the ground and gather more attentions. Government may or may not like it, but now that they have noticed that there's this new type of engagement method from the people, I think it adds more pressure to them to take action quicker. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Emily. So if I may add in a bit of input myself. So I think that's a very interesting question. And at the end of the day, we want to make sure that our policymakers hear our voices. And I guess what I can share a bit is, when you look at things such as the task force to update Malaysia's NDC, which is chaired by the Kementerian Alam Sekitar and Air, they are actually open to listening to the voices of youth. But at the same time, things like this, you will only be aware if you are within the loop. If you're not within the loop, you won't be aware of such channels whereby you can actually, provide feedback to the government as to what you think should be done about the climate crisis. We can go on that as we go into further discussion. So a question for Mr. Muru from Diana. I feel like climate change education needs to begin in school so that once they're at voting age, they are well prepared to raise their voices. So has the government or education system considered this? What's the current development? We'd like to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, I think we've been talking about environmental education for a very long time. I think the question was whether it should be a standalone topic or whether it should be integrated across all different skills-based education with this math, science, your language. I think climate change, I think climate change is one part of it, right? People seem to think that it's the biggest environmental problem in the future. That's fair enough. I guess, it's a phenomenon, environmental degradation, sustainability, and all that needs to, I totally agree it is. At this point of time, I think it's being taught in one of those primary school subject matter. I'm not sure whether it falls under Kamaira and Hidup or anything. I've lost track about I got kids in school, but I lost track because some of the things they're studying, even I probably had problems understanding. Meaning that when I was school primary in the 70s compared to now, some of the things I was wondering. We were in standard 1 and we were studying ABC, but nowadays, you're not expected to go to standard 1 and try to learn ABC, right? They expect you to know ABC by then, to read and write by then. So things have changed so much. So I totally agree. Yes, I think there's already been a push to look at these modules in the Ministry of Education. But the fact is, I think end of the day is whether the question is going to happen immediately or is going to happen, in 5 years' time, because the curriculum for education seems to be constantly changing. Sometimes it sounds quite political as well. But one thing we all must always agree, the fact that environmental degradation is something, it's a global good. In terms of environment is a global good, right? If you destruct the environment, or people can see, right? You can't run away from the fact. Governments can't run away from the fact. The aggressors can't run away from the fact, right? The perpetrators can't run away from the fact that you're polluting the environment. So it's very difficult. As I said, finding evidence and science behind environmental degradation is much more straightforward than looking in other sectors, right? Very philosophical, political, ideology, religion, or whatever not. But I guess environment is one, it's a global good, it's important for Malaysia, and someone is trying to destroy it is easy to find solutions, too easy to find evidences to back it, and easy for activism to actually go out there and say, why are you polluting that piece of river? Because you'll know where the source is coming, and you can stand there and make a case for it. You can make police report, etc., etc., and DOE comes and do stuff, and obviously whether it becomes a court case and whether those perpetrators are arrested at the point of time, it's secondary. The question is, without activism, you wouldn't have find all these conventions in the world. You wouldn't have find a convention on climate change. You wouldn't have found a convention on biodiversity. This is all start of people mobilizing, demonstrating. This is all done by, a lot of this is driven by civil societies, right? And somehow rather at some point of time, government takes stock of all these things. Then they said, okay, right, this is a big issue globally, and let's create a convention, get all parties in, all governments in, and work for a solution. So I will never, in other words, I would never dispel or belittle the powers of activism, because every action that happens globally, the environmental side or human rights sides or whatever it is, actually starts just small bunch of people seeing an issue and mobilizing enough numbers and voices all over the world and turning it in a very formal conventions like we have for the climate change. So we shall not belittle that line. In that sense, the power of people is very important. So a question on, yes, it's nice to get some sort of environmental education, looking at climate change across all the subject matters, and also instilling that in young minds. Therefore, when they come to a certain age, they'll be more responsible in finding solutions. Some of them will become entrepreneurs, own businesses. Therefore, it's good the way that we need to have responsible businesses. We need to have responsible entrepreneurs. If you end up in government, therefore you will look into all these things. I guess that's an ideal situation, starting young and building the momentum. At this point of time, it's probably starting in a very siloed, or maybe those parents are quite affluent who understands this, probably be giving more lessons. But I think it should be an equal opportunities for everybody to have that kind of understanding. Problem, the issue of environment now is it's becoming very affluent. It's becoming very urbanized type of topics, nice things to do. But I think we need to see that the most vulnerable people to any environmental degradation are the poor, not the rich. So I think we need to be fair in that sense. And obviously, environmental education can play a stupendous role going forward. Whether in Malaysia, hopefully we want to see it, the next few years that it happens. I think we should. I think students, young minds are easy to shape in a way, and they can debate, they can talk about the agenda with their parents, and they can be great influences going forward. Yeah. Thanks, Shakir.
Thank you for that, Mr. Muru. All right, we've got time for final one or two questions, and I'll read out the questions in full. Perhaps Emily and Jasmine, as well as Mr. Muru, you feel free to add your thoughts to this. So we've got one question from Nicole as well as another from Budley. So for Nicole's question, I think it's difficult to ask youth to mobilize in climate action, anything especially at the policy level, when as far as I know, the government has done the bare minimum. I'm curious to know what have been the government's key developments in climate adaptation and mitigation in the last year. So that's one question. And then the final question we'll take is from Budley. Since climate change is the biggest threat for our future, how can we encourage more youth from all segments and backgrounds to be on the same platform? Emily, for the first question, since the work you do is policy related, I was wondering if you could, if you'd like to share anything on this. And for the
Sorry,
second
do you
question,
mind to repeat that? I think my line was breaking at
oh,
that
sorry,
point.
sorry. Yeah. So essentially, Emily, in your opinion, what has been the government's key developments in climate adaptation and mitigation from the last year?
Okay. I would say it was very political because we had a very promising climate change minister during the Pakatan time, YB Yobin. So that time, climate change was really high on the agenda. Also, thanks for having a very influencing minister. But unfortunately, due to the political change, I would say development on climate change and has been slowed down for the past 1 to 2 years. I think key development-wise, we already established the National Steering Committee on Climate Change, and the first meeting have already happened, I think a few months ago. And so it is a good start, I guess, because that committee itself is chaired by the KSU, and it was the members consist of other ministries representative as well. And moving forward, we hope that the council itself, the Climate Change Council, will set on as well, which will be chaired by the Prime Minister, and that will have a higher weight, I would say, in the national agenda. Yeah, I think that's a promising development, although, like I said, slowly but surely. Thank you.
Yeah, just a quick one on that. Yeah, so these committees are definitely the sort of things we young people should be pushing for as far as inclusion is concerned, to make our voices heard. Right, Jasmine, so going to Fadli's question, to repeat, he asked, since climate change is the biggest threat of our future, how can we encourage more youth from all segments and back to be on the same platform? And
Yeah,
Mr. Muru, feel free to add your thoughts as well towards the end.
Thank you, Shakil. Thanks, Fatih, for the question. And also, I'm just like sitting here, right, like taking all in like what Mr. Muru and what Emily has said. I'm like, wow, like so much knowledge. Like, how would I even top that? And I'm just like reading through all of your amazing questions. You guys are pretty well informed, and I'm so impressed. And very, very important questions that I don't know if we sempat or not to address all this. But yeah, hit us up after this session, and we will be happy to talk to you about it. But again, I think like I would sort of revisit back my point on having a dedicated platform for all of youth climate advocates, people who are proactive in climate action and taking action in preserving and conserving the environment, because I really do feel that we really need to convene all these amazing young voices. Because with this collective approach, with this mobilization, our voices will become stronger, and our voices will carry more weight. Usually, like when I give my talks, I always start it off with a meme. Like, it's the meme of like this youth like drowning with their hands up on the surface of the water, and then it goes like, like, oh, we need to solve climate change, and then you have this politician who sees the young person and just gives this person a high five, and the youth continues drowning. What I'm trying to say is that we need all hands on deck. Yes, the youth voices are powerful, but we also need to complement it with political action and also further action on the ground. Our climate policies and plans are great. They're there. We have all sorts of framework. We have all sorts of convention. But where does it really matter the most? It really matters the most when we actually implement it, and when we actually hold our leaders accountable to the actions. But again, like, we are all aware of the many challenges that we're facing. Even Emily said, like, the most hardest part when it comes to like policy is the implementation part. But also, like, I think I want to say that In moving forward, we are all pretty much aware of how important climate change is and will be, especially like with these impending crises. I would also want to say that climate change should not be a siloed approach within the Ministry of Environment alone. It should be cross-sectoral and interministerial. It should be a priority that sits in within all of the different ministries, such as Ministry of Youth and Sports, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Finance, because once it is loud enough, once it is important enough, then they would really take it seriously, you know. But until then, we reflect back, we do things that we can within our own capacity. Individual action matters, but it being done collectively, thus the butterfly effect, multiplying it and amplifying it with a whole of society approach, then our voices will become stronger, bigger, and louder, and that is where we can create more waves and action. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Jasmine. Unfortunately, we do not have, we're out of time as far as Q&A is concerned because we have to go into our breakout session. I believe the Eco-Nights team will assist in dividing all the participants into their respective groups. So without further ado, your task is as such. Imagine you are a youth representative in your community. You notice ongoing issues in your area that are affecting the environment and our climate. So you need to form a working group and develop a community action plan based on the following components in accordance with the relevant SDGs. So as I understand it, we will have 3 working groups broken down into the social aspects, the economic aspect, as well as the environmental aspects. And each group will be working on one aspect only. Is everyone, Celine, will you be assisting with the breakout groups, dividing everyone into the groups?
Yes, from back end, we'll be doing that in 1 minute. Yeah.
Okay, cool, got it. Also, just for everyone's information, for the questions that we did not answer, don't fret, we will have your questions directed to the speakers and we'll have them answered, and I believe we will have them posted on SongNet as well, Project Vocal's social media. So if you haven't followed us on social media, please check out Project Vocal on Instagram, and Twitter.